Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on July 13th, 2023. And this week we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party testing a new app that requires citizens to pre-register in order to attend a religious service. And this would enable them to limit the number of people who can assemble at any given time. And of course, this also fits with their current practice of limiting the number of state-approved churches that citizens can legally attend. There are a few points that I want us to consider here today. For links to the article we're talking about, as well as some other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/071323. And now for our story this week. Christian persecution intensifies in China with mandatory worship app. From Charisma News. In a troubling development, it has been alleged that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is testing a new app that demands citizens pre-register before attending religious services, further restricting religious freedom. The Voice of the Martyrs, a persecution watchdog, revealed the CCP has rolled out an app in Henan province, requiring individuals to seek approval through the app in order to attend any kind of religious gathering. Todd Nettleton, Chief of Media Relations for the Voice of Martyrs, explained that citizens must provide personal information, including their identity, address, and ID details, to the Chinese government through the app. The approval process is limited to churches registered with the CCP, leaving house churches and unsanctioned gatherings with no opportunity to obtain permission. Authorities can now easily check for compliance by asking attendees to present their phones and open the app during church services. The app, known as Smart Religion, has been developed by the Ethnic and Religious Affairs Commission of Henan Province and applies not only to Christian churches but also to mosques, Buddhist temples, and other religious spaces, as reported by CBN News in March. This app-based regulation raises serious concerns about privacy and personal freedom. With the ability to track individuals and capture their information, the CCP gains further control over citizens' lives. Nettleton warns that the app could potentially expand throughout China, as seen during the COVID pandemic when a similar app-based control was implemented for public transit in certain buildings. Now, this story was one that I came across about a week and a half ago. I've already mentioned it in the Bible class I teach at the congregation where I preach on Sunday mornings because it was related to what we were studying there in our Bible class. But I wanted to share it here now in the podcast. And we've, in different episodes, discussed certain things about what the Chinese government has been doing to persecute Christians. I'll include a couple of those in the show notes. One of them in particular was about Chinese authorities interrupting a so-called Zoom church service and forcing them to stop preaching. This here is another way for the Chinese government to suppress the religious practice of its citizens by forcing them to register with the government in order to attend a religious service. And not only do they do that, but they restrict the options that they have to only those religious services that are approved by the authorities. And this is being tested, as the article said, in one province, but more than likely that means it's just going to be tested there and then implemented more broadly after that. There are a few points, 3 points in particular, I want us to consider briefly here today. Number one, it is not far-fetched that this sort of thing could happen here in the United States. This tracking of citizens and limiting the number of people at a particular religious gathering, some people might say, well, that could never happen here. The problem is, it already has. During the COVID pandemic, here in Kentucky, the governor announced that they were going to be recording license plate numbers for the cars that were parked at church gatherings in order to impose quarantine orders. Notice this quote from the Kentucky governor that appeared in an article in Newsweek on April 10th, 2020. Any individual that's going to go to a mass gathering of any type that we know about this weekend, We are going to record license plates and provide it to local health departments, said Bashir at a press conference. Local health departments are going to come to your door with an order for you to be quarantined for 14 days. This was in Kentucky, in the United States, which allegedly is a free country. Now, is it as bad, or even then, was it as bad as what we are hearing about in China? No. But it does show that what we hear about in China with these types of things happening, it's not unthinkable that that could happen here. And so we need to be prepared for it. The second point, whenever the state makes a list of approved churches, you can be sure it will not include churches that are faithful to Christ. If they're talking about these churches are approved and these churches are not, you have to attend these churches over here. Those churches that are faithful to Christ will not be on the approved list. You think about China, and that the article that we read, it talked about there were certain churches that were approved, that you could attend those services. You could get permission from the app to attend those services. Well, there were other churches that were not included. There are 2 government-approved churches in China. The Catholic Patriotic Church and the Protestant Three Self Church, neither of which you can read about in the Bible. When it comes to the church that you can read about in the Bible, notice what was said about it by the Jews in Rome when Paul came to them at the end of the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 28. They said to him, "We have neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor have any of the brethren come here and reported or spoken anything bad about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for concerning this sect, it is known to us that it is spoken against everywhere." When it talks about that sect, they were talking about the church, the Lord's church. Why was it that the church was spoken against everywhere? I'll have an article linked in the show notes that I wrote a little while ago about the sect that is spoken against everywhere, and going through the reasons why, when we look at particularly the book of Acts, why the church was spoken against everywhere. You can read that article to see all of the reasons that are there, but basically it comes down to this. The Lord's church is going to put Christ first and will refuse to compromise in order to appease the world around them. Civil rulers who want to usurp the authority of God are not going to like that. They don't want us listening to someone higher than them. They want to be the highest authority over the people. And those who are faithful to Christ, in churches that are faithful to Christ, they're not going to put the rulers on that type of pedestal, because they know Jesus is Lord. He is head over everything. And so those churches that are faithful to Christ, that preach that and practice that, they are not going to be approved by those rulers who are only going to sanction churches that fall in line with them. The third point, when authorities mandate things like this, Christians are free to ignore those mandates. I mentioned earlier that I brought up this news story in our Sunday morning Bible class recently. We're studying the book of Acts, and we're talking about the apostles' arrest in Acts chapter 5 when I brought this up. Notice what the text says there in Acts chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. The high priest said to the apostles, "We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us." But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men." When the apostles were confronted about this, they didn't say, "Well, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done that. We won't do this again." They said that they were going to obey the Lord no matter what the rulers said about it. Notice what happened at the end of Acts chapter 5, at the end of this encounter with the rulers and their threats to the apostles. Verse 40, it says, "They took his advice," referring to the advice of Gamaliel, And after calling the apostles in, they flogged them and ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and then released them. So they went on their way from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they had been considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they kept right on teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. So the apostles were threatened, they were told not to preach, they were even beaten, but they kept preaching anyway. Why? When we talk about civil authorities and our responsibility to civil authorities, we often emphasize the responsibility to submit to civil authorities. Passages like Romans 13 and verse 1 tell us to do that. But Peter wrote in 1 Peter 2 and verse 13, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and the praise of those who do right." So Peter said that we are to be in subjection, or we are to submit ourselves to civil authorities. But that submission is conditional. When the law that is handed down by civil authorities, when their law contradicts God's law, then Peter, who wrote those words that we just read, was also the one who said in Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. Notice what Peter wrote just after telling Christians about being subject to authorities in 1 Peter 2:16. "Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God." I just wrote an article on this verse and posted it on the Plain Bible Teaching website last week when this episode is being released. The link will be in the show notes. The article is titled, "Act as Free Men." But the point I want us to remember is this. As Christians, we are free in Christ. That means we are free from sin. We are free from the bondage of sin, the punishment of sin. It also means, though, that we are free from any obligation to follow rulers who pass laws that are contrary to God's law. When the authorities pass some law that requires us to do something that is contrary to God's law, or try to hinder us from serving the Lord in some way, we are free to simply ignore them. And that's exactly what the apostles did in Acts chapter 5. They were told not to preach. They ignored it. And they simply went out and preached anyway. So that means that if the authorities are requiring us to register through some app in order to attend a religious gathering with some state-approved but not God-approved church, then Christians are free to ignore that. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be repercussions. When it comes to that, we need to be willing to suffer whatever it is that comes from that, just as the apostles were. They rejoiced that they were able to suffer shame for the name of Christ. We need to be willing to do the same thing. And then also, like the apostles, keep doing what the Lord wants us to do. That's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. Hope you found this episode to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to the story we talked about, as well as other related materials, visit the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/071323. If you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or share it with others that you think would be interested, that is always appreciated. And if you're listening to this, remember that we are also uploading video versions to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So if you prefer video to audio, that option is there for you. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can see other videos that we post here. I mentioned that I am currently teaching a Sunday morning Bible study as we're going through the book of Acts. I'm also, as I'm preparing those lessons, recording video lessons on the book of Acts. I am currently in, I think I'm about to release chapter 10 when this episode released, or maybe just release the first part of chapter 10, depending on when they fall. But you can watch those videos, those Bible studies on the book of Acts. Those will be on the YouTube channel. And if you see a news story that you think would make for a good discussion, send that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.